Thanks for coming. It's obviously a special pleasure to be here tonight. It's difficult to find a more appropriate place to make this presentation than in the Skyscraper Museum in New York. It's also a little bit intimidating because the audience might be more knowledgeable about the actual topic of this research, which is about urban towers compared to towers which might be less urban in other places. So in a way, just to always jump to the end already, is the situation that we find here is one which is obviously extremely interesting in terms of high-rise and stands in some kind of tension with other places in the world. As already mentioned, so that's the second book of a series which is published by Wiley. Each time I've been working with other partners. This one with Julie Jambal, who is a French art historian, at that time teaching at the Université de Pau, which is close to the Spanish border, and now finishing at the Sorbonne her PhD thesis about the history of high-rise architecture in France. And a third person who worked with us was Philippe Honorat, an engineer for WSP Group, who has been has high-rise experience in New York, London, and now heads the office in Paris, involved also with several projects ongoing in La Défense outside of Paris. Maybe we can jump to the next slide already. So just here a short content list of this presentation. I'm not going to go only through the book itself. The book has to be understood somehow, not in order to make a point in itself, one single point. It's more like a dictionary of typomorphological research, the way how high-rise can be inserted in an existing urban fabric, or how a new urban fabric can be built with one high-rise standing next to the other. So in a way, each of these examples are of major importance, and it's rather the knowledge that we would like to convey about those different examples, rather than to make a specific point as such. So we're going to have a glance at the book itself. Afterwards, we're going to explain actually a little bit about the background. I mean, why have we been working about 2 years, almost full time, on these projects? So, and we're going to explain why this kind of typomorphological analysis, as boring as it might sound, could be, of major importance. And the point C is actually to explain the main reasons why this is done quite rarely, right? I mean, most existing books are about just the tallest projects as such, about the building techniques, while we are looking much more at the urban background of those projects. So I think the Form Follows Finance book by Carol has been quite inspiring from that point of view for us. By the way, also the exhibition about density in Hong Kong in this museum has given us many ideas, and examples are existing in the book. Then, again, of major importance is the whole issue of high-rise and density. People could just say in New York it's difficult to make this claim, but let's say in other places you could say, why do we need high-rise, right? Well, if we are saying that our population is growing rapidly and our cities are getting larger and larger, in order to avoid sprawl, obviously the whole issue of density and how we can use high-rise in order to build density is just a key point as such. And afterwards, just one single example about the meaning of the tower in the cityscape, because then again, for many critics, the problematic of the tower, the modern tower, is somehow to destroy the logic that we had in the historic city of how public buildings relate to private buildings. And this is going to be explained at the example of New York, the Rockefeller Center, which is maybe tricky because some of you might actually know more about the Rockefeller Center than I do. Next slide, please. So again, as I mentioned, the book is the second book of a series out of 3, maybe more later, I don't know. The first one here, published in 2009, written together with a German colleague, Caroline Stahl, who is an architect, has been working in quite well-known offices in Paris. The idea here was and it was the whole starting idea for me to write, because I'm now teaching at the University of Miami, but actually I started writing these books much before actually I wanted to go into academia. So these books have been financed by private investors and not through my job as a professor. So I was able to convince people like Rowena Savills and Stanhope to finance traveling more than 2 world tours just for this book. And what we did was a selection of 30 housing types, traditional, most of them of the 19th century, some of them more vernacular, others beginning of modernism in the 20th century. So we were explaining, and this is just one example here. It's a plan that we have drawn in the 17th arrondissement in Paris. It's a quarter that has been built after Haussmann, so around 1890s. Haussmann left office in 1870, but still in the same logic. So you can see here, those very repetitive type of buildings built along the corner with party walls, and they often share a courtyard in the middle here. So we just very simply wanted to analyze those most famous housing types and redraw architectural plans and see, how they relate to the urban fabric. So very straightforward, explaining a little bit the background of these developments. The English terrace house would be one example. And by the way, the only New York example and the only one touching high-rise was the last chapter, which was the beginning of high-rise residential building in New York. At the example of, you will see a plan later on, of the Upper East Side in around the 80s in New York. So this was the starting idea, this book. And then afterwards, a friend of mine from Paris came back and said, I quite like what you did here. My father and I, we have a development company, and we built one of the towers close to the Eiffel Tower, just 5-minute walk, which were built, 20 towers in the 1970s mostly, built on a podium along the Seine River, quite well known. So his father built one of those towers. And he said, well, we have a strong discussion at the moment in Paris again to maybe raise the limitation of the buildings in order to come back, maybe building high-rise in the city center, which at the moment still is forbidden in Paris. And maybe we would like to be involved again in those kind of projects. So wouldn't you be interested, and I could help you also financially, to do a similar study which is urban and not architectural, but for high-rise and not for those projects which were mainly low and mid-rise. So that's how actually the projects got going. Then I got to know the co-author, Julie Gimbal, actually in going through the main architectural library in Paris, and she was just quite intrigued by the fact that I came with 1 meter of books about high-rise, and she, writing her PhD, got probably a little bit nervous about that. So, and then we decided to work together. So next slide, please. And so that's the cover that you have already seen, with obviously Marina Towers here in Chicago on the right and the Gherkin on the left. If we go into the next one, and here we, the book has 3 chapters. The longest part, the longest chapter is this kind of typomorphological dictionary of how to insert high-rise in an urban structure. And that's the part that I've been mainly working on. The second part is, and I will show that later, is how high-rise regulations have been used in several cities around the world in order to, to make the urban development working in the best possible way. At the example of 5 cities. And the third part is about sustainability in high-rise, written by this engineer, Philippe Honorat. So the first part here, again, is cut into 3 parts. The first one are examples of solitaires, so freestanding buildings inserted in an urban fabric. Or, by the way, not necessarily freestanding, but solitaires, so buildings that have been developed as one entity. The second part is clusters of towers, so several buildings being developed at the same time. And the third part is something that you could consider high-rise cities. So we consider there's a difference between just accumulating a single buildings and then to get to a logic where Manhattan would be one example, even though Manhattan, obviously, even Manhattan is not really a high-rise city, but parts of Manhattan are. So the third part of this dictionary is actually explaining the specific logic of places like Hong Kong and Manhattan, and I think Dubai is also an example. So here we have the example. Then what we did is to try to explain diagrammatically very quickly what our selection is about. So the example here would be the solitaire is a monument in a block. So that's the example of 30 St. Mary Axe, which probably all of you have at least seen. So it's also called the Gherkin, designed by Foster and Partners. And obviously it's a freestanding building, so that's why we still call it a monument. So you have a plaza around, but as you can see here, it's been sitting in a very dense urban context, and that's what makes it specifically interesting, having actually a quite important density. Density is something that I will comment on at the very end of this part, because that's where we have all the figures in comparison. So if you just go through that chapter, I mean, I'm not going to explain everything. There's so much to say about all these projects, but I would like to go further into the background and why we did this. Interesting here that the building has been built on the side of a historic building which initially was meant to be kept. So it was a listed building, or it was threatened to become a listed building. But at the end of the day, this proposal by Foster & Partners was considered to be so interesting also by the mayor, Livingston at that time, Ken Livingston, that it actually received the building permit. So the initial structure has been torn down, which was a low-rise building, in order to build this tower. Next slide, please. And so you can see here in this section, how closely this building is situated next to its neighbors, still having a plaza around it. Very interesting, and Norman Foster has done that several times, also with the Commerzbank building, which is, by the way, another example in the book, but not in this presentation, where he's actually trying to come back to an idea of courtyards in a high-rise building. That's something which existed, I have to think again of your book, in the early Chicago buildings, because they were often built on a square site, and quite large squares. So they were still had the opportunity to have a courtyard in the middle, also because they were tall, but not extremely tall. So obviously the taller you get, the more difficult it is to have this courtyard. And what Foster has done in the Commerzbank building here and in other projects is actually to have this kind of spiraling courtyards, which are not in the center of the tower, because the building is just too tall, but they are somewhere on the periphery, which gives quite an interesting interior relation between those balconies. And obviously it's also a very good feature for the natural light of those buildings. If we jump to the next one, yeah. And so you can see here, all those drawings are completely repetitive. We always have at the same scale, and that's the case for all the three books, is we have one aerial photograph which has been scaled as 1 to 5,000, and we have here a redrawn urban plan at the scale of 1 to 2,500. Again, there's not so much to comment on that, but it's just relatively difficult to find these plans, and that's why we thought it would be worthwhile to, in this case, to pay somebody to do these drawings. And the sections here, obviously a smaller one, because we had a slight layout issue there. So please, the next drawings. And then what we did in each, not each chapter, but for each case study, we added two secondary examples which fall into the same category. So the category, again, here was the monument in the block. So we considered that Jean Nouvel's Akbar building in Barcelona, standing next to the Diagonal, had a similar urban situation than the Gherkin, but you can see here that it's rather positioned on the corner, even though the rest of the block would still be built up. So that's a new development zone, and what you can see here on this diagram will change over time. So at the moment, this tower here, as beautiful as it is architecturally, and I'm a great fan of Jean Nouvel, is actually, from an urban point of view, still, it lacks a certain framing around this, but this is something that's going to happen, change over time. And here, one of the classics, again, you know it probably specifically well, is Van der Mies and Philip Johnson's Seagram building, which also has been very influential in terms of the change of the zoning laws, because the decision of Mies to actually, to leave a plaza space in front of the building, which, as you know, is quite untypical at that time for New York development, and just to build on the part of the plot which was allowed to rise as high as possible, is actually something which has been then copied for the next generation of building regulations for high-rise. And the Rockefeller Center that I will touch upon has actually copied this method for these new buildings which have been built along the Avenue of the Americas. So the extension of the Rockefeller Center. So again, we saw that from an urban point of view, there are actually quite some similarities between the Gherkin and this one. It means like a high-rise being sitting in a very dense urban context and with a plaza right next to it. So next slide, please. Now we are jumping in the second category. So we are jumping into one example of the clusters. And here we have what we call, I think, a 3D carpet. And quite unknown compared, to the Seagram building, compared to the Gherkin. It's a project which is at least internationally not known, but even in France, not like extremely known. It's in Créteil. It's in one of the suburbs of Paris, and it's actually at the very end of a period which started in the 70s, which was called the construction of the Grand Ensemble. So the Grand Ensembles were the big, mainly public housing developments, which also created many problems that you've probably heard about. I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago there were those unrest, even coming not only staying in the banlieue, but coming into the city center of Paris, where especially specifically young people living in these kind of developments became showing their kind of frustration for good reasons or not. I don't want to comment on, but that's this kind of political background of this kind of discussion. It's these projects which have been mainly or completely financed by the public hand, often been designed by one single architect with one single team of consultants. And that's the beginning, it's rather the end of this period, coming to a notion where you were looking for more kind of functional mixture as much as social mixture. Even though this is still mainly public housing here, from an architectural point of view, obviously what you can see the specificity is this kind of cabbage leaf balconies. And the architect Gerard Grandval, which is now over 80 years old, but still working those projects here from the beginning of the 70s, he explained to me that the idea was to have a fairly generous, for public housing, fairly generous balcony in order to make the relatively restrained interior, more livable and attractive. And if we jump to the next slide here, so you see some images. You can see the floor plans, very efficient somehow. You just have the staircase in the very center. The problematic of that, obviously, is that it's going to be very dark, right? But it's efficient in the sense that you have this opening to the exterior, and you have a very modular approach. So the structure, obviously, is always the same, and you're just trying to cut sometimes into it in order to make apartments of sizes which go from a 1-bedroom to a 3 or 4 bedroom, and you can see here how the whole topic of the curve has been maybe even somehow exaggerated. We can jump to the next slide here. So we have redrawn again at the same scale this area in Créteil, and you can see that there's a school incorporated, and the garages here are just copying somehow the same shape. The buildings then are all public housing. Those here on the corner are private developments, or at least partly private developments. So it's this idea of having at least a certain kind of a social mixture. And the other mixture, a programmatic mixture, came through one shopping mall, a small shopping mall, I think, which is situated not in the center, but rather outside. And the reason to put it outside was to make somehow connection to the university, which is situated on the other side of the road. So the idea here, and I'm not sure that it really worked, was to have a mixture of communities between the students and the people living in this high-rise or mid-rise development. Again, high-rise is quite a question of how you define it. So if we jump to the next example. So these are the secondary ones. On the left-hand side, a project that has been published many times. I don't know if it was once here in one of the exhibitions here. It's Janwai Soho by Riken Yamamoto and a French architect and another firm who have designed a pretty large part of what is called today the Beijing CBD. So the interesting about the Beijing CBD, which is by the way an example of this of our third book about master planning, is that it mixes office developments with residential developments. So this was meant to be mainly residential, but what I've heard is also because of the building quality, actually most of these spaces are now rather used for offices and actually not for apartment building. And quite interesting is how Yamamoto here, who's not a young architect, is playing around with this notion of modernism. So you can see there's a kind of white towers, very pure, very repetitive. But if you analyze it in more detail, and that's where we didn't have the space here, it's actually that it's quite elaborate. You know, you have different levels of circulation. You have an insertion of these kind of so-called villa buildings, which are not residential, which are retail developments. And so you have a very rich mixture of uses in this development. It seems to be highly successful, except of this building quality issue, which happens sometimes in Chinese developments. And here, to the right, I'm very happy that Mary Byrne, who is in the audience and is living in Stuyvesant town, actually helped me to do some research. Again, it's one of the examples, a whole chapter in the next book about master planning. So here we're actually only showing some pictures. It's a project which you have probably read a lot about also in the local news, which was, I think, one of the biggest real estate deals some years ago by Tishman Speyer and Blackstone. Tishman went, I think, almost bankrupt with this project. And now I don't really know who owns it. It's somewhere in limbo, by the banks. And it's a project which has been set up at the end of the war and was, with major political pressure, meant to become one of the examples of how urban renewal can also happen in the city center and happen only with private developments. So this was built by MetLife Insurances, but the whole story behind it, and it's too long and too complicated to explain it right now, is that actually it was possible only through major subsidies given by the city or the state, and which made it possible to tear down the gas house district, to to dislocate the existing population, and to build this enormous development here in Manhattan. We probably know it all. If not, it's really worthwhile a trip. And yeah, I think there's so much to say, but we just continue. And here we are jumping into the third category of this typomorphological dictionary, which are high-rise cities. Again, I preferred here to show the lesser-known example, which is an area which is not that specific, but it's a very clean and very good example. It's called Higienópolis. It's an area, it's a district in São Paulo, situated close to the city center, the mainly office center on kind of top of this hill. And you can see here it's a very specific type of high-rise construction, very, very dense. You can see here this is just a view from the street towards, through one block, and with a very rectangular, elongated shape. But we see that better on the next slide. The next slide, please. So you see these quite amazing images here of the type. And now, to better explain the type, we might go to the next slide. Or the next one, please. Yeah, here. Just to explain the story behind it. So, Higienópolis is something like a garden city. I think it was founded in the very beginning of the 20th century, if not end of the 19th century, I think by a German and a French developer together. So it was meant to be an upper middle class villa district. And that's how the regulations were. So what those developers did, they just bought the land, they made this kind of grid layout, very simple, very straightforward, and then they sold the plots together with a certain amount of building regulations. And so part of the building regulations is that you need to have a setback from the street, and that you needed to have a setback from the sidelines. So it's actually building regulations that you find very often. But with the specific circumstances of São Paulo, what happened over time is that obviously those villas were destroyed. Many of them were free. They were actually empty because at a certain point the middle classes fled the inner city. So those houses which were quite large were actually empty or had lost their value, were in a bad state. So developers bought them and started to build ever higher apartment buildings, but still keeping the same regulations. There have been some changes of regulations, obviously, over time, but what you can see here, that you still have to keep a difference from your neighbor. So what we actually arrived to is some kind of Manhattan, if Manhattan had not been built on the logic of party walls. So I don't know what at the end of the day, Manhattan is built like a terrace house. So you build one house next to the other, and the walls touch each other. While here, because the building regulations, it was not possible, you come to this kind of construct that you have seen on the images before, where you have high-rise buildings going up to 40 stories. I mean, I think you can call that high-rise. And you have still somehow buildings which cannot touch each other. This, by the way, is a view of Avenida Paulista. It's a slightly different logic. Avenida Paulista is built on, how do you call the street, which is on top of the elongated mountain. So that's where large villas were. So and from that point of view, it's a similar story. But the urban logic is slightly less repetitive than in Higienopolis, which I've shown you behind, which is an area which has been built, like a checkerboard in the surface, while Avenida Paulista is more a linear development. And here, also very interesting, and that's too much of a topic maybe to go into detail, but obviously the modernist tower block that we know about is usually also the egalitarian one. It's a public housing tower block. It's a tower block of people, who are at the maximum middle class. While here, what you can see in São Paulo, and that's one of the plans, it's a typical building plan of these developments in Higienopolis. It shows actually a mixture of a 19th century building, like a housefront building in Paris, which has its service area, in the back. So you have actually a staircase for the service people and even accommodation for them. While you have, the larger developments in, obviously the orientation, which was probably more interesting or had more light. If that's north-oriented, probably not. I don't think that's north-oriented. So, but what I found quite interesting in doing the research is actually to find an example of a tower block plan which has more a social logic of a 19th century building rather than the modernist one. But that's a long story. So if we jump further, and then now we are jumping into the work of my colleague Julie Jambal, and she has chosen 4 cities worldwide. Actually, she did 7, but then we only had space for 5. It's quite unfortunate. Excuse me. And next to cities like Manhattan, London, Paris, and I think Vienna, she also explained Frankfurt, which I thought here maybe again would be quite interesting for you because somehow lesser known. What she was doing in all her examples is to show, the existing high-rise buildings and those which are projected. So I think the existing ones here are the red, and also the monuments. So you have monuments are the yellow, the built ones are the red, and the projects are the kind of. I think it's not easy to see them here, but it's probably the blue one. I don't know why there's somehow a color mix-up, but the blue ones are the projected. A famous one, by the way, is the headquarters of the European Central Bank by Kurt Himmelblau, which is just in construction right now. If we jump to the next one, so what she was trying to explain, what she did, is to explain how the city governments have used the planning regulations for high-rise in order to give a certain logic to the high-rise development of the city in the future, in the cities to come. Frankfurt is quite interesting because while being a mid-sized city, I think even today, the city itself is probably around 600,000 inhabitants, not much more. The area a bit more, but it's still not, not comparable to Paris, London, or New York. But it is a high-rise city, and it always had this history, obviously on a relatively modest scale, but it always had a history of high-rise. And what she describes here is the different visions that existed. So at the very beginning there was an idea, if you see this here, there's obviously the historic core. So there was an idea to delimit the historic core with high-rise around it. Then afterwards they came to another plan which was called a finger plan. So they rather thought, well, this did not really work or it didn't make sense. So we are rather trying to have some kind of extensions of the city core through high-rise to the outside. Again, that's this kind of planning that has been done in several cities. And then what's the scheme that's working on today is rather to say, well, maybe the easiest way to work with is to work with clusters. So we define one cluster here, and that's where most of the Commerzbank building by Foster and Partners is situated somewhere here. I'm not sure which one it is. But to have one cluster on the border of the city, and then to have another one around here. Unfortunately, one of the big projects was linked to putting the station underground, so building high-rise above a station, something which will probably be done now in Stuttgart. and this, I believe, has been cancelled for the time being in Frankfurt. So this was meant to become another major cluster for high-rise, partly already existing. So we are just trying to explain, what have developers to follow as rules, where are they allowed to build, and we don't really have the time here to go into much more detail. Next slide, please. And yeah, you can see here one of the models, which is standing in the city planning office of Hamburg, explaining about this kind of cluster formation of buildings. And again, a big topic I think about high-rise is the marketing effect that it has for the cities and how important it is for them. So when I was talking about the headquarters of the European Bank, interesting is actually that it's not going to be built in one of these clusters defined by the city planning services, but it's going to be built somewhere else. For what reasons, I don't exactly know, but this has also happened with other projects, so you can feel that high-rise projects have such an ability to put pressure on the city government simply because the city government doesn't want to lose this interesting project. So in many cases, actually, we've found out that these kind of high-rise regulations are not always completely followed, because there's always a way to find a political solution around it, and Frankfurt can actually give several of these examples. Next slide, please. And here, by the way, that's I think we have to come back. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So we are jumping actually here. There's the beginning missing, but this is just part of the essay which has been written by this engineer, Philippe Honorat, about the very tricky relation between sustainability and high-rise construction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about density, and I think the density issue is the most crucial one, talking about high-rise development and sustainability at the moment. What he's trying to explain here is, for example, here that we have a section through a project in Seattle, and we can see here the logic actually, and that's quite a traditional way of how the elevators are organized in a high-rise building. And it shows also, the problematic and the enormous energy that is demanded in order to make such a high-rise building work. So the point is to say, just to make a longer story short, is that with all the building techniques that we are experiencing today, we can make high-rise much less energy, much more energy efficient, but still the building techniques, for example, through propellers, or that's not propellers, how do you call the machines which,
Wind turbines.
Through wind turbines, we can save energy, but at the end of the day, it's not through these wind turbines, it's not through solar panels that we can actually say we have to build high-rise because then the wind turbines are going to be more efficient. So there are different extremely interesting techniques which are going on today, but they still cannot explain or really give an excuse for high-rise construction. The high-rise construction makes sense, and if we go to the next slide, if we try, and that's here the energy consumption, so one of the biggest actually, one is AC, the other one is the elevator. So again, one of the biggest problems is to, for example, to make it possible to open the windows as high as possible, even in a tall building. And that's how you can save energy for AC. The other point regarding the elevator is, for example, and that's techniques which are becoming more and more proficient, is just to use the energy of move, in order to give it back to the building. But that again, at this point, is not going to be sufficient. So we have to use density issues in order to make high-rise more sustainable. It means also that if you, for example, have a residential building and you have an office building, they're not going to be used at the same time. So it means that the AC energy can actually be used, for one building, while in the other one it is not used at the same time. So you can actually, you can have an exchange of energy while one high-rise is standing closely to the next. And that's one more reason why density, putting one building very close to the next one, is so key for the issue of sustainability and high-rise. But it's not the main point of this presentation. Next. And as we see a little bit about this, that's about the different use of energy during the day and during the night, and how you can use different techniques in order to save this engine energy. For example, to give heat back by night into residential buildings. And here this is just an image of the quite impressive Burj Khalifa in Dubai, the tallest structure in the world, or the tallest building in the world at least. And it's just to express again that while you can be very much in favor of high-rise, many critics will say, if you see the energy which is needed to build this, it takes a lot of time to get it back, even through a very high density. And Dubai, one of the problems of Dubai is that it actually doesn't have this very high density. That's one of the advantages in New York. So if we go further, that's one image here of Tokyo. And we go further. And here just, to go, if possible, relatively quickly through those main points and a little bit the background, because I've already touched upon this right now. And it obviously has all to do with urban sprawl. I'm living now and teaching since last year in Miami, so that's a city which has a lot of urban sprawl, and which, by the way, has also an issue of not sufficient public transport networks. And, to be very simplistic somehow, what we would like to do, where high-rise seems to have more a sense is in a dense case like Manhattan compared, in order to avoid a situation like here, for example, in Los Angeles, where you have your sprawl, which is covering, many hectares of land. And you can make the assumption, which for me, without really knowing the figures, that a city like Los Angeles, for the same, let's say, the same amount of population, would consume more energy than Manhattan, because also everybody obviously has to use his own car, which is not necessarily the case in Manhattan. If we jump to the next one. And very, very simple again. One of the points is, why do we want to avoid urban sprawl? It's not only to spend less time in cars, it's also for ecological reasons. So the idea is just to be able to keep more green space outside. So if you see a city like London has a green belt, right? So if you want to keep the green belt, at a certain point, if you still have raising population figures, it means that you have to consider high-rise in order to make this residential population not flow into green spaces. Then again, it's obviously, I have to admit that it is a simplistic view, because you can try also to have a minimum of seal through asphalt, ceiling levels of the city, while having a maximum amount of parks inside a city center, or having just many trees with enough openings so that the rainwater can flow through. So that's an issue which also should not be simplified too much, which I think the density point still has a validity. If we jump to the next slide. And here, very interesting, I was mentioning Miami, and I have developed a certain sympathy for the city, but what is really frustrating is public transport. And I think one of the issues for those of you who know Miami is how can you actually make the public transport viable also financially. It means that you need a certain catchment area in order to make it worthwhile to build those metro lines. So at this stage in Miami, you have only one metro line, which is an elevated metro, which combines the major conurbations along the sea, but you don't have any other connections, just because people to walk there there are just not enough people to walk to the stations in order to make it worthwhile. So another point in favor of density is just to make public transport networks viable, also financially. I don't know if the metro here makes a profit, but at least it makes much less. It makes more money than if we didn't have the residential density that we have. So we have millions of people every day who can use the public transport in Manhattan. And here we just see a picture of Rio de Janeiro, where actually I experienced this kind of fantastic pyramidal building seen from a tram going up the river. And quite an extreme image here. That's the center of Hong Kong Island. Again, I had to think of the exhibition which took place here in the Skyscraper Museum, where actually the whole network of retail, of restaurants, can work because of the density, also because of the density which is given through high-rise construction. Now, we could claim Paris also has, enough retail and enough restaurants without building high-rise in the city center. but high-rise can help to make that happen. If we jump to the next slide. And here, the main argument for its absence, so again, it is the absence of kind of typological research of high-rise and how one high-rise building relates to another high-rise building or to non-high-rise buildings surrounding it. And it's actually what these two slides are trying to say is an extremely simple point that just linked to when I mentioned, the Foster project and the idea of reinventing a courtyard in the tower. Is here, if you look at these developments here, they cannot have any kind of internal courtyard. They're just far too tall, but that's also the case for those who are much less tall. So there is a certain extremely simple faculty of high-rise, and that's rather a limitation than a faculty, is that it is extremely extroverted. You need a core with the areas which do not need lights, so it's going to be the elevators, the technical equipment. It has to be in the center. And then you have obviously all the areas for residential use or for office use, for working use, which are around that. But what's one of the consequences is that at least in the upper parts, if we take away the base in the first, potentially in the first, let's say 10 stories, the upper part is always the same typology, and it's somehow really poor, right? You have a building which is extroverted to all sides. And that's what I'm comparing us here with one of fantastic hôtels particuliers in the Marais district in Paris, where you have a certain succession of internal courtyards. So the point, in a way, is quite polemical, maybe, to make. But I think it's one of the reasons why it is actually so difficult to work with high-rise in an urban way. Again, Manhattan somehow being an exception to this point. If we jump to the next slide. Another reason here is that another reason for the absence of such studies is just that high-rise is fairly new. I will say 2 words about kind of vernacular predecessors of high-rise, but at the end of the day, we can say that the modern tower dates from somewhere in the 1880s in Chicago. That's where most people date it for technical reasons.
Its exhibition dates at 1875.
Okay,
New York.
So the 1870s, let's say. And but that's if you see the history of architecture, the history of urbanism, this is extremely new. I think one of the reasons why there is so much progress for high-rise to hope for, and I think that's why the museum is so extremely useful, is that we didn't have so much time to do the research. And we see here that, looking specifically, obviously, as European cities, if we look at the Torre Akbar, sure, it's an exceptional building. But it's an exceptional building also because, all the other structures are mainly just maybe 5, 6, 7 stories tall. So, the fact to see high-rise as something repetitive is therefore quite new also for historic reasons, simply because it didn't exist before. And we have here this is the building, actually, the Tour Montparnasse, which was the reason why the president himself, I think it was Pompidou at that time, actually declared a ban on high-rise construction in the city center, because everybody hated this building, which I have to say now, to be honest, has a certain architectural quality. I mean, it has this kind of oval shape, and until now looks almost new, and I think it's almost exactly my age, so it's from 72, it's 40 years old, so it's actually architecturally, I would say, a pretty good piece of work, but people somehow did not agree that in an area like Montparnasse, which all this story, you had to destroy so many buildings, build this new station, and then the tower right next to it. So again, coming back to the French discussion, which is still ongoing, and probably the crisis wasn't helpful, but let's see how that works out, is to see how we can somehow change the existing regulations to have some more diversity again in the future, so that Paris doesn't become a museum city. And you can see here, talking about exceptions, that's a view of São Paulo, where you can see cities where the high-rise building, and there's not only Manhattan, where the high-rise building is not such an exception anymore. So next slide, please. And here we have the almost, I don't know if you have shown it, so I don't want to insult anybody.
We did, yes.
I don't want to insult anybody, because you never know who is behind these buildings, and maybe you once want to work for them. But it's kind of an extreme case of how the high-rise can be used as a marketing tool, in order to convey this idea of power, of something very special. And here I would say kind of a mixture between Big Ben and Godzilla in a slightly unfortunate way in Mecca. I had a short discussion with Carol just now, and it was a little bit about the background of research. So, we met with many architects, many developers, many people working for city planning offices, and they were extremely helpful. We had very interesting discussions. But in many cases, you also felt, because a lot of our research was about ongoing or future projects, is that, everybody wants to present his project as being the latest, the newest, the most advanced. So our view, which was more a typological one, obviously a little bit collided with this kind of vision. We just wanted to see how, even the most advanced building might be, from at least an urban point of view, be part of a group of buildings rather than an exception. So I'm trying to say that, to make a typology of high-rise, and we are obviously not at all the first to do that, but it's something which can be quite conflictual compared to the main marketing aims of the people who do actually design those and finance those buildings. So the next slide, please. Then density, again, I think we don't have to spend too much time on that. I've spent quite some words on talking about the whole ecological idea behind it. But what I was trying to explain here is all this also has to do with a certain ideology behind this. So the vision of high-rise has very much been informed by politics also. And I think this is probably less developed in the US, so I'm not sure if you can follow that much as I'm saying, but if I make this presentation in France, everybody knows quite well what I'm talking about. It's this kind of mixture between grand ensembles, these public housing developments, and they are somehow being very quickly, in the public opinion, taken together with high-rise construction. So you have this kind of unfortunate relation of being high-rise, creating social problems and not being appropriate for the society that we wish to have. So I'm just going to the different, next slide please, to the different stages. So we have some examples of vernacular high-rise, or let's say height. So these are, for the first book, I went to Sanaa, and these are those fantastic tower houses, which you can also find in other Yemenite cities like Shibam. And you can see quite an interesting urban logic of these buildings, which are going up to 8-9 buildings, stories, for one single family at that time, at least. Usually it was built for one family, and how they sit next to each other for several reasons. They have to do with defense, they have to do with the price of the land, and also with the fact just to use the upper part for kind of a place to have a view to the outside and the quite fantastic mountains surroundings. And then you have examples like San Gimignano, which is, I would say, too often used by architects just to claim that they have had so fantastic ideas. Again, these are quite interesting examples, but I would still try to claim that the modern tower somehow is a different story. It's a different use. It's mainly an office use, at least those built in the US at that time in the 1870s, 1880s, were mostly office buildings. So I would say that that's an interesting category from which you can learn in terms of urban insertion, but it's still a very different story. So if we jump to the next category, which are the first skyscrapers I just mentioned around the 1870s, 1880s. So this is obviously not New York, this is in Chicago. We can see, what's the urban logic of these buildings. You can see the party walls. You can see the different ways. These were kind of courtyards which are covered now. This is the U shape, which is trying to, to get as much natural light as possible towards the interior of the building. And you can see what kind of urban scene this creates. And to be honest, from our point of view, this was very much, the positive view of high-rise. Even though we also know, I remember, going to visit friends in New York, and often they just lived in apartments where you almost didn't have any light, right? So from an urban point of view, this can be considered to be a very positive example, but the reason that today we tend to build high-rise slightly different than those early examples obviously has also to do with the fact that you have a quite large percentage of these buildings which has not enough light. So I think the whole next story which is following was in a different slide. No, this is still the same here. This is actually the beginning of high-rise construction in Europe. So these are quite amazing project in Stockholm. It's called the Kungstårnen, built around mid of the 1820s. At that time, the tallest skyscrapers. Well, in Europe, and all these projects, and that's one in Villeurbanne. It's in the banlieue outside of Lyon in France. These were projects which explicitly were relating to the US, which at that time was already, number one economically and also military-wise in the world. So the early American skyscrapers became like the symbol of success for Europe also and the rest of the world until today. So next slide. And then now we're jumping into the next category, which is I'm never sure about the word, if it's a modernist or modernistic tower. It's, those developments which are very much formed by the ideas of Hilbersheimer, of Le Corbusier, of Gropius, and the idea that the tower should be freestanding. It's a tower in park configuration or the tower on podium where you're just trying to have a very egalitarian system with a maximum of natural light for everybody. So this in a way meant also that you had to increase the distance from one building to the next and as much as possible to get rid of the party wall, which is the crucial part of high-rise building in Manhattan, for example. So we have here, that's actually the tower which I just mentioned, built by this friend in the 1970s or early 80s. So it's just a 5-minute walk south of the Eiffel Tower. It's the base, which is over 1 kilometer long, with 20 high-rise buildings built above it. The base, the upper part of the base, which was meant to be the main circulation, pedestrian circulation part, never really worked. And there are today actually some works ongoing in order to make it more attractive and to get the people to not use the secondary entrances, which are in the kind of the tunnels going underneath, but rather to go up on the edges to the podium in order to actually use this, at the end of the day, quite heroic modernistic space. And this is the Hansaviertel in Berlin, built after the war in the end of the 1950s as a response to the Stalin Allee built by the communists in the eastern part of the city. And it's all a long story. Next slide, please. And here we are the urban plans that we have redrawn, because both examples are also examples in the book. And you can see here what I just explained. It's just to keep as much space as possible around it, with a certain implication, obviously, for the density of those projects. But we will see that later. And here we can see the Front de Seine. That's the. So some streets are going underneath, other streets are rather bridged up here, and the whole development continues further up. So if you are in Paris, it's worthwhile to having a walk. And they're actually building somewhere here a new huge shopping mall to again make it more attractive. Because this is, in the 15th arrondissement, it's actually quite an expensive arrondissement. And by the way, those towers here were mostly not public housing. These are quite expensive private apartments, which, as you can imagine, have an amazing view on Paris and the river Seine, which is there. So next slide, please. And here we have, again, this falls somehow in the same category, the modernistic tower, the Créteil development that I mentioned. And this is here in South London, planned by the very Corbusian development, but not designed by Le Corbusier, but following his ideas. It's situated somewhere in Western London. And I've forgotten the name. But it's one of the crucial major projects of that type, the Tower and Park in the UK. And we jump to the next slide, please. And here again, you could also consider Stuyvesant Town actually to be part of this. And then again, we are jumping back into the US-specific situation, which I would say is a little bit more pragmatic than the European one at the same time, or the European part earlier, the early modernism of the 1920s and 1930s, where here you have obviously a tower in park typology, and this whole was branded as a suburb in the city. Stuyvesant Town was explicitly, marketed as a suburb in the city. But you have also a centralized urban plan, which, for example, in the Hansaviertel had been explicitly negated because you didn't want to come back to kind of symmetrical developments because they were considered to be a kind of a bourgeois expression of the 19th century. So we can find here actually some elements which are, very modernistic, but other elements which are less so. So it's quite an interesting pragmatic approach to some ideas of that time. Please, next slide. And so what I'm trying to say, and I think the Skyscraper Museum is showing this with many exhibitions, that we are today in a new phase, which could be called the contemporary high-rise, where we have projects which do not really fit in neither of these earlier categories. So we are not rebuilding the 19th century tower as you can find it in Chicago or here, but we are playing around. So you can playing around in cases which many people would rather criticize, like here Sheikh Zayed Road in Dubai. I mean, it's one of the most impressive car rides that I ever had. It's like driving along this corridor of high-rise, which reminds, by the way, a scheme of Auguste Perret for the port of Paris. So here we have, a very different approach and something which did not exist before. You have a mixture of projects like the Burj Khalifa, which mixing up, office with hotel, with residential and whatever. And we have here another interesting example, also because the Mori Development Company and Mr. Mori behind this project and many others like that in Tokyo has actually is also doing some research with this company in order to promote the green high-rise and the high-rise development, which is combining all different functions in one single development. And what's also quite new here is how one development, even though one developer is behind it, so the Mori Group in that case, is actually giving the design work to different architects. Again, that's something which usually did not happen for the modernistic tower, where often everything was done by one single entity. And here, the tower itself done by KPF, then I think the shopping mall underneath by John Jurdy, and you have the television center by Fumiko Maki, I believe, and the towers, I don't know by whom, I think by Conrad, by the way. So you have new concepts which are playing around with green roofs, with parks which are elevated, with functional mixture, which people like Hilbertsheimer would never have wished to become reality. And so we have a great opportunity in order to invent, and that's happening every day today, the tower of the future. The next slide, please. Some other examples here. I mentioned the Commerzbank building in Frankfurt. Again, I mean, you could say that Foster & Partners Foster is still a modernistic architect, but on the other hand, he's very pragmatic. So I find it quite interesting how this 19th century structure, block structure of Gründerzeit apartment buildings has been, just closed down with the same height with the base building, and then actually the tower, which is situated in the block center, where there's a lot of ambiguity of how much you're actually unveiling the tower, especially relations. Hopefully.
Thank you. Okay, so I would make a comment, which we can conclude and then have informal questions. But I guess since this is rather an academic discussion, and you have been studying and analyzing with teams of people and subsidized by funders and all, I would say that the greatest application of the analysis, which I find extremely interesting, is an application for governments on the one hand, because I think it's better if building regulations can change quickly so that we can adapt to make better cities by virtue of regulations, because what you are showing us is that it's really regulations of land use or of zoning that shape buildings. But then and I'm in complete sympathy with the idea that we need more high-rises in order to have greater urban density and therefore better cities. And you identify the three specific legs of the stool for high-rise mass transit and parks that are necessary in order to make good cities. But I think in addition to the next step of integrating the factor that you're talking about, but that it's not clear to me that you identified, this marketing analysis, is what needs to be brought into the discussion of how you make better cities. Because I think, and this is something that we've been talking about for a while here, that the way to make a formula that could be applied by governments in order to make better cities is to really analyze what kinds of urban spaces people enjoy. And I totally agree with you that density is the key word. That's what we want to analyze, is density. So one way to analyze what makes people happy or makes high prices, which is an indication of people being happy, let's say, is markets. So putting markets back into mass transit parks and high-rises as a way to demonstrate what are successful by virtue of people voting with their pocketbooks about the competing for space, whether it's rents in Rockefeller Center or buildings at the top of apartment towers, seems to me the direction of the integration of these elements of analysis that need to be explored much more by architects, because you can bring a qualitative analysis to the spaces that are urban, bring the economic analysis to it in order to make a political analysis about what governments should do in order to make better cities.
Yes, I believe that the discussion has to be deepened, definitely. And it's interesting that you were talking about marketing, because we're meaning like how to market somehow better high-rise. When I was referring to marketing rather about the market strategies of the developers.
No, that's what I do mean. I do mean that, the market strategy of the developers, because developers know better than anybody how to make places that people want to pay a lot of money for rather than be forced to live.
Yes, but I think the discussion has to be made broader and has to be deepened. And you know, what I think in some cases, it's quite interesting how often you go, you speak to city officials, or you just go on websites, and for new projects they try to sell, and it's obviously often the case also in Middle Eastern or Chinese project, they're trying to sell a new piece of Manhattan. So just because there are some towers, it's considered to be a new Manhattan. And there's this kind of discussion which can make me crazy, because it is on such a low level, and typologically it's completely meaningless. And I think if we stay on this level, then we cannot have an exchange, because then, you know, it's a lie. So there are marketing people trying to communicate a lie, which then people have to react to. They cannot openly, because you know, this is not something that would be appreciated. But on the other hand, everybody says that it's a discussion which is on a low level. So I think we just have to speak more and more about high-rise, to have this kind of institutions, so that we can, you know, we can get to a better solution. Because the solutions often are not yet that convincing.
Okay, great. Well, let's take the opportunity to thank Eric. I'll pour some wine.
Then we can stay.
On the areas where you are. I was mentioning also the Hansaviertel, the modernistic one, and again, we are just not even at 2 for the Hansaviertel development density. Roppongi Hills in Tokyo, again, fairly good, and I think you can see the figures yourself. The Front de Seine was this kind of tower and podium development south of the Eiffel Tower, and this, again, is about the density just of the usual Parisian arrondissement. And Lujiatsu, because I saw it here, it's one of your exhibits in the museum. This is just the area of the tallest buildings in the new financial district of Shanghai, which has quite a high FAR, but again, this is the FAR just around the tallest towers. Okay, so if we jump further, and here, I'm not sure. Shall we maybe start with questions? Or
Yeah,
I think
we should.
Yeah, the point here was just to say a little bit about, what's the importance or the opportunity of high-rise in the cityscape. And this is one, Leon Krier he designed the auditorium at the University of Miami. It's probably not a great fan of high-rise construction, but he draws very well. So I was just trying to explain, the usual idea of how the perfect city would be structured, right? This is the Res Publica. It's obviously the high-rise buildings would only be churches, and then you have some taller structures, which tend to be all public structures. And this is going to be mixed up with the private developments, which are mainly going to be just residential, which is obviously not showing offices, I guess. And this is, what could be called civitas. So this is kind of the vision that we would have of a city like Florence or, whatever. Maybe Paris could even count as being part of that. And obviously for many people, high-rise is being considered an element which destroys this beautiful logic. And so this last chapter was just trying to face this down. And the example of the Rockefeller Center, which has this highly interesting about the Rockefeller Center is that with all the research that we did and the developers that we met, the Rockefeller Center is almost always considered to be one of the most positive examples of how to use high-rise in a very positive urban way. And interesting about this is how it actually contradicts the utilitarian grid. And let's maybe just jump forward. So this is just a commissioner's plan. And this is obviously the expression of the egalitarian, utilitarian grid, which compared even to what had been done in South America under the Spanish crown with the laws of the Indies. This plant at least always had like the Plaza Mayor in the center, while the extension plant in 1811 here of Manhattan had even at this time an extremely modest park-only plant, and no major idea of a central square, so it's completely egalitarian. And what's interesting about the Rockefeller Center, and maybe we can jump further, that's a study that we did here in the Upper East Side, just trying to explain how high-rise went more and more up at a certain point in time. And so we jump further, and these are the plants. Oh, just one comment here. I was promised to finish. I made a comment here about the light conditions of Manhattan, right, in many apartments. And these apartments, as you can see, obviously, that's an apartment along Park Avenue. I think it's somewhere there along Park Avenue. It's this one there up there. It's interesting that the tallest building at that time, they appeared along the avenues which were wider, and they tended also to appear on the corners. And why? Because you had the easiest solution to gain natural light, to make a working architectural plan while still having some light. But even those corner buildings here had the problem that at least you have today, if you're not a multimillionaire, is that how you're going to use this part of the building here, right? Which is, of kind of mediocre interest in terms of view and natural light coming in, at least for the lower floors. So that's kind of as positive as you can see high-rise in Manhattan. But I believe that's also the downturn of this typology and of the 19th century buildings or early 20th century buildings, that they kind of only worked when you had enough surface space to give over. If you don't have the surface space, and that maybe explains also the modernistic tower, you just need to create better light conditions, because otherwise you just have people living in quite modest qualities. And if you jump further, that's the story of Rockefeller Center. Interesting is that here by Vista Morris, the architect, the beginning, when they were looking for a new place to build an opera, and then approached Rockefeller, there was still an idea of some kind of Beaux-Arts inspired scheme. So I think the opera scheme was somehow linked to a European tradition of how to build symmetrically with a central plaza. And it's interesting how this has been kept if we jump further. And this was just to say how you can actually compare the party wall system of a city like Manhattan and here a piece of Paris next to the Luxembourg area. Next slide, please. And here, and it's kind of the Raymond Hood, that's a study that he did, I think more or less at the same time, or maybe before starting to work on the Rockefeller Center, where himself, he was actually working on let's call it the City of Towers. He was working on something that you could actually compare with the Plan Voisin by Le Corbusier, where actually he wanted to isolate buildings in the Tower and Park situation. And the Rockefeller Center is interesting in the sense that it combines very different ideas of urbanism and somehow is almost in contradiction to the actual grid. And if we jump to the next scheme, next one please, you can see that this kind of situation, as you know very well, is completely untypical for Manhattan. And even these streets here, I guess that you probably find some other exceptions, but for the grid above First Avenue, First Street, this is something that you will usually not find. It's also not typical to have this kind of symmetrical arrangement. So I was just trying to explain the enormous complexity that you can find even while building high-rise. Is there a next one? Yeah, and yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Maybe a couple of quick questions if the audience has it, and we can also do it informally, but are there questions?
Can I ask, is there a pressure in Paris to build more high-rises? And how are they, if there is, how are they dealing with that? I know they doing some in the perimeter, but is there any discussion in Paris about changing that, permitting more high-rise in the interior part of the building?
Yes, it's a big discussion. Funnily enough, the French version of this book, I think, has sold better than the English version in the rest of the world, which still is not a lot, but it's quite interesting. I think this has a lot about this, that, the topic, the discussion, at least, let's say 2-3 years ago, was really hot, because there's some kind of political pressure. So again, I think you have to separate from the discussion about growing cities, growing populations, and trying to find answers, density answers, to that issue. And obviously the other point is also linked to marketing. So, and I think you can be, I'm somebody who is relatively, negative about only talking, presenting projects as a kind of marketing strategy. But then again, you have to say that for many cities, high-rise construction has been, a way of showing that a city wanted to do progress, a way that the city wanted to change, to improve its conditions. And so I believe that the discussion comes from different points. I think it was also the government, the former government, who actually wanted to promote high-rise in order to say, okay, we're not going to be a country or a city of museums, but we also want to show that we are jumping further. We can do what London does, and we can do what cities do all over the world. So there's a discussion about how high-rise can really be useful, and there's also a discussion about how we can improve this marketing. And talking about you can still really ask the question, why do we need a fixed limit of buildings in Paris, right? I mean, sure, as tourists we love this kind of urban environment, and we would like to keep this consistency. But if you really look into the future, I mean, for what reasons could you really forbid to maybe raise this kind of height limit in the future? And to be honest, Tour Montparnasse is not something that I would like to see repeated many times in Paris. But now I would definitely not be in favor of tearing it down, because it has become a landmark. It actually is a landmark which is very helpful to orient yourself in the city. That's a point that I never mentioned, but it is true. And so it's a long discussion, and I think the fact that it takes so long to change building regulations is actually a very positive thing. So you need a long discussion in order to, and you need also the proposals which are worthwhile in the discussion. Because if you don't have, and that's one of the reasons why we hope our book can be inspiring, is just that, you know, I believe that there can be a new generation of high-rise which is worthwhile to consider changes of building regulations. Hopefully. Thank you.
Okay, so I would make a comment, which we can conclude and then have informal questions, but I guess since this is rather an academic discussion and you have been studying and analyzing with teams of people and subsidized by funders and all, I would say that the greatest application of the analysis, which I find extremely interesting, is an application for governments on the one hand, because I think it's better if building regulations can change quickly so that we can adapt to make better cities by virtue of regulations, because what you are showing us is that it's really regulations of land use or of zoning that shape buildings. But then and I'm in complete sympathy with the idea that we need more high-rises in order to have greater urban density and therefore better cities. And you identify the three specific legs of the stool for high-rise mass transit and parks that are necessary in order to make good cities. But I think in addition to the next step of integrating the factor that you're talking about, but that it's not clear to me that you identified, this marketing analysis is what needs to be brought into the discussion of how you make better cities. Because I think, and this is something that we've been talking about for a while here, that the way to make a formula that could be applied by governments in order to make better cities is to really analyze what kinds of urban spaces people enjoy. And I totally agree with you that density is the key word. That's what we want to analyze, is density. So one way to analyze what makes people happy or makes high prices, which is an indication of people being happy, let's say, is markets. So putting markets back into mass transit, parks, and high-rises as a way to demonstrate what are successful by virtue of people voting with their pocketbooks about the competing for space, whether it's rents in Rockefeller Center or buildings at the top of apartment towers, seems to me the direction of the integration of these elements of analysis that need to be explored much more by architects, because you can bring a qualitative analysis to the spaces that are urban, bring the economic analysis to it in order to make a political analysis about what governments should do in order to make better cities.
Yes, I believe that the discussion has to be deepened, definitely. And it's interesting that you were talking about marketing, because you're meaning like how to market somehow better high-rise. When I was referring to marketing rather about the market strategies of the developers.
No, that's what I do mean. I do mean that, the market strategy of the developers, because developers know better than anybody how to make places that people want to pay a lot of money for rather than be forced to live.
Yes, but I think the discussion has to be made broader and has to be deepened. And you know, what I think in some cases, it's quite interesting how often you go, you speak to city officials or you just go on websites, and for new projects they try to sell, and it's obviously often the case also in Middle Eastern or Chinese project, they're trying to sell a new piece of Manhattan. So just because there are some towers, it's considered to be a new Manhattan. And there's this kind of discussion which can make me crazy, because it is on such a low level, and typologically it's completely meaningless. And I think if we stay on this level, then we cannot have an exchange. Because then, you know, it's a lie. So there are marketing people trying to communicate a lie, which then people have to react to. They cannot openly, because you know, this is not something that would be appreciated. And on the other hand, everybody says that it's a discussion which is on a low level. So I think we just have to speak more and more about high-rise, to have this kind of institutions, so that we can, you know, we can get to a better solution. Because the solutions often are not yet that convincing.
Great. Well, let's take the opportunity to thank Eric.